The frontier did not announce death. It delivered it without warning, without mercy, and without witnesses who cared enough to remember your name. In the summer of 1823, along the raw edges of the Missouri River, men learned quickly that survival was not about strength or courage. It was about endurance. And sometimes, endurance was simply the stubborn refusal to stop breathing. Hugh Glass had already lived longer than most men expected. He was a mountain man, a trapper, a drifter shaped by rivers and winters rather than towns or laws. His face carried the permanent look of someone who had seen too much sky and too many graves. He had been captured once, long ago, by the Pawnee. He had learned their ways, their patience, their silence. The wilderness had tried to claim him before. It had failed. On that day, Glass was scouting ahead of General William Ashley's fur expedition, moving alone through tall grass and broken timber. The air was heavy with summer heat, insects whining like distant wire. His rifle rested easy in his hands. He had walked this land long enough to trust his instincts, and his instincts told him nothing was wrong. Then the ground exploded. The grizzly came out of the brush like a force of nature, giving muscle and teeth. She was massive, faster than thought, her cubs somewhere behind her. Glass barely had time to turn before her weight hit him, knocking the breath from his lungs in a soundless rush. But the rifle went flying. His back slammed into the dirt, and then the claws came down. The first strike tore into his shoulder, shredding flesh to the bone. The second opened his chest, snapping ribs like dry twigs. He screamed once before her jaws closed around his throat. Her breath was hot and foul, her teeth crushing, her growl vibrating through his skull. Glass felt skin tear, felt blood pour down his neck, felt the sudden terrifying looseness where his life was being ripped away. He did not fight her. There was no fight to be had. He was being dismantled. The bear rose on her hind legs, her full weight bearing down as she slashed again and again. His back split open. Muscles tore. His spine burned as if fire had been driven into it. Somewhere in the chaos, Glass realized he could no longer feel his legs. The world narrowed to pain so complete it swallowed all thought. This was not dying. This was erasure. Shots rang out, distant at first, then closer. The bear recoiled, snarling, spinning toward the sound. Another shot. Then another. She collapsed only a few feet away, her body twitching, her rage bleeding out into the dirt, beside the man she had nearly destroyed. By the time the others reached him, Hugh Glass was no longer fully conscious. What lay on the ground barely resembled a human being. His scalp hung loose. His throat was torn open so badly they could see bone and sinew. His back was a ruin of torn flesh, white ribs showing through red meat. Every breath came with a wet, bubbling sound that made the men turn away. No one thought he would live. They thought only about how long it would take him to finish dying. They carried him back to camp on a makeshift litter, the smell of blood following them like a warning. Flies gathered instantly, thick and relentless. Glass drifted in and out of awareness, caught between pain and darkness. Sometimes his eyes opened. Sometimes they didn't. When they did, there was something in them that unsettled the men around him. Not fear, not pleading. Just a raw, furious awareness. They laid him on the ground and did what little they could. There was no medicine for wounds like these. No surgeon. No miracle waiting to arrive by riverboat. His body was too broken to move. His injuries too severe to imagine recovery. Even the most seasoned trappers shook their heads. He should have died that first night. But he didn't. The hours passed. Then the night. Then morning came, and Hugh Glass was still breathing. Each breath sounded like it might be the last. His chest rose unevenly. Blood soaked the dirt beneath him. Fever took hold, his body burning as infection crept through torn flesh. Men sat with him in shift, watching, waiting. Waiting for the moment when they could stop watching. Glass drifted through memories and hallucinations. Faces from his past surfaced and vanished. Rivers he had crossed, winters he had survived, fires he had shared with men long dead. At times the pain pulled him back into himself so violently that his fingers twitched, his jaw clenched. At other times, he went frighteningly still. By the second day, the expedition could not delay any longer. Hostile tribes had been sighted nearby. Supplies were dwindling. Stay meant risking everyone. Leaving meant abandoning a man who, by all logic, was already gone. They argued quietly at first, then openly, then angrily. In the end, they made a decision that frontier life had made countless times before. Hugh Glass was dying. The wilderness would finish what the bear had started. The expedition would move on. 2 men volunteered to stay behind until the end came. One was John Fitzgerald, hardened, impatient, ruled by fear he would never admit to. The other was a young man named Jim Bridger, barely more than a boy, eager to prove himself, unsure of his own judgment. They dug a shallow grave nearby. They laid Glass beside it, his body wrapped loosely, his rifle set against a tree. They waited. Glass lay there, his mind floating somewhere far from his ruined body. But deep beneath the fever and pain, something remained awake, something old, something that refused to release its grip on this world. His heart kept beating, stubborn and relentless, long after reason said it should stop. By the 3rd day, Fitzgerald's patience snapped. He stared at the broken man and saw only delay, danger, death waiting to happen. "This ends now," he said. Bridger hesitated. He looked at Glass's chest, still rising, still falling. He looked at his eyes, half open, unfocused, yet alive. Doubt twisted in his gut. Fitzgerald did not look again. He took the rifle. He took the knife. He took the powder horn. He told Bridger the man was gone. He told him this was mercy. They covered Hugh Glass with earth. As the dirt fell, as the light vanished, as the weight pressed down on his shattered body, something inside Hugh Glass stirred. The world went black. And somewhere beneath the soil of the American frontier, a man who should have been dead refused to be. The first thing Hugh Glass felt was weight. Not pain. Pain had already become a constant, a distant roaring he could no longer separate from himself. This was something different. This was pressure, earth pressing down on shattered ribs, dirt filling the spaces where air should have been. The world above him had vanished, replaced by a crushing darkness that stole breath inch by inch. For a long moment, minutes, hours, maybe longer, his mind drifted without direction. Fever dreams tangled with memory. Faces appeared and disappeared. Firelight flickered. Voices echoed as if underwater. Somewhere in that darkness, something inside him refused to go still. Then his lungs spasmed. The need for air hit him like a blade. His chest tried to rise and failed. Panic surged through a body too broken to react. His fingers twitched against packed soil. Nails scraped dirt. The sound was muffled, swallowed by the grave that had been hastily dug for him. Hugh Glass was not dead. He had been buried alive. The realization did not come with screaming or thrashing. His body was incapable of either. It arrived slowly, brutally, as understanding settled into his mind with the same weight as the earth above him. He remembered the voices, the argument, the way they had stopped looking at his face. He remembered hands lifting his rifle away, fingers searching his belt. He remembered the sound of dirt falling, not in a dream, but in truth. They had decided his life was no longer worth waiting for. The air was already running out. Glass forced himself to slow his breathing, shallow and controlled, each inhale scraping raw tissue inside his chest. His throat burned where the bear had torn it open days earlier. Every breath felt like it might split him in two. Darkness pressed closer at the edges of his vision. This was how men disappeared on the frontier, not with ceremony, not with names carved into stone. Just a hole in the ground and a decision made by someone else. His thoughts turned, not to God, not to forgiveness, but to anger so cold and sharp it cut through the fever. Fitzgerald's voice surfaced first hard, impatient, afraid. Then Bridger's face, young and uncertain, eyes refusing to meet his. Glass understood then that death was not what terrified him most. It was being erased. Somehow, through pain that should have ended him, he began to move. Inch by inch, fingertips clawed at loose soil. His arms trembled, muscles screaming as torn flesh stretched and reopened. Dirt spilled into his mouth, his nose. He coughed, choking, swallowing earth and blood together. The grave had been dug in haste, shallow, careless. Glass did not know how long it took. Time had lost all meaning. There was only effort and breath and the crushing need to reach the surface. When his hand finally broke through into open air, rain hit his skin like ice. Cold, real, alive. He dragged himself out of the grave and collapsed beside it, half in, half out of the world of the living. Rain washed mud from his face, ran red where it mixed with blood. He lay there for a long time, unmoving, letting the storm do what it could. The night wrapped around him, indifferent and endless. Somewhere in the distance, wolves howled. Morning came slowly, gray and merciless. Glass opened his eyes to a sky that did not care whether he lived or died. His body was a ruin. His back was a map of torn muscle and exposed bone. Infection had already set in. Fever shook him uncontrollably. He could not stand. He could barely lift his head. But he was alive. That fact alone felt like defiance. He took stock of what had been left to him. Nothing. No rifle. No knife. No flint. No food. The men had taken everything that might have made survival reasonable. What remained was a broken body and a stretch of wilderness that would take months to cross on foot. If he had been whole. Glass laughed then, a wet, broken sound that tore at his throat. It hurt. Everything hurt. But the sound meant something important. He was not finished. He tore a strip of cloth from what remained of his shirt and wrapped it around his mangled throat. He rolled onto his stomach and screamed as his torn back pressed against the ground. Then, with a grim patience learned over years of surviving things that should have killed him, Hugh Glass began to crawl. Every movement reopened wounds. Blood soaked into the earth beneath him, marking his path in dark streaks. His arms shook violently, barely able to support his weight. Sometimes he passed out mid-motion, only to wake with his face pressed into dirt and insects already gathering. He learned quickly that stopping meant death. Days blurred together. Hunger gnawed at him until it became a constant ache, then a distant throb. When he found the carcass of a bison, long dead and rotting, he did not hesitate. He cut away what he could with sharp stones and let maggots clean the flesh he could not reach. He ate slowly, deliberately, forcing himself to keep the food down as his stomach rebelled. At night, the cold crept into his bones. He dreamed of fire and woke to frost. He dreamed of hands pulling him upward and woke choking on his own blood. Each morning he crawled again. The wilderness tested him without cruelty, without emotion. Rivers blocked his path. Storms battered him. Once, a pair of wolves followed at a distance, waiting. Glass met their eyes and kept moving. Eventually, they fell back, uninterested in prey that refused to behave like something dying. Through it all, one thought anchored him to the world. They had left him, not nature, not fate, men. The betrayal hardened inside him, sharper with every mile he dragged himself forward. Fitzgerald had chosen fear over loyalty. Bridger had chosen obedience over conscience. Glass did not imagine speeches or apologies. He imagined faces. He memorized them. He promised nothing aloud. Weeks passed. His wounds began to scar over, ugly and permanent. Fever broke and returned again. He learned to sleep lightly, always listening, always ready to crawl. By the time he reached the banks of the Cheyenne River, Hugh Glass was no longer simply surviving. He was enduring. The man who emerged from the wilderness weeks later barely resembled the one who had entered it. His body was twisted with scars. His eyes had changed. Something inside him had been stripped down to its rawest form: pain, will, and a debt that demanded payment. He did not speak of forgiveness. He spoke only of names. And somewhere ahead, beyond rivers and plains and law, those names were still breathing. By any measure that mattered, Hugh Glass should not have been moving anymore. A man with his injuries was meant to lie still and wait for the end. His back was a lattice of scars and half-healed wounds. His ribs had knit themselves together crookedly. Infection lingered in his blood like a second heartbeat. Every breath still burned. Every movement felt like tearing open a history of pain his body had not forgotten. And yet, each morning he moved, not walking, not even limping. Hugh Glass crawled across the American frontier like a creature dragged forward by will alone. His elbows were raw and bleeding. His knees had lost all feeling. Sometimes his arms failed, and his face struck the ground hard enough to knock the breath from his lungs. When that happened, he lay still until the world stopped spinning, then dragged himself forward again. The land did not change for him. Rivers still ran cold and fast. Plains still stretched endlessly beneath an empty sky. Storms still arrived without warning. The wilderness did not slow to watch. It waited. Glass learned to read the earth from inches away. He learned which grasses cut and which bent. He learned how to follow animal trails low to the ground, how to listen for danger without lifting his head. His world had shrunk to what lay directly in front of him, measured in arm lengths and heartbeats. Hunger was constant now. Not sharp, not dramatic, just a dull, hollow presence that hollowed him out from the inside. When he found something edible, he ate it. Roots, berries, carrion. He did not waste energy thinking about what a man should or should not eat. Survival did not care about dignity. Once, he came upon the remains of a deer pulled down by wolves days earlier. The meat was blackened and crawling. He used a sharp shard of bone to cut away what he could, then let the insects do the rest. Maggots cleaned the rot. Glass swallowed hard and ate slowly, forcing himself not to retch. The food burned his throat, but it stayed down. That night, he slept beneath an open sky, feverish and shaking. He dreamed of fire again. He dreamed of his rifle. He dreamed of Fitzgerald's face, turned away. When Glass awoke, the pain in his back had changed. It was deeper now, heavier. Infection had flared again, the flesh hot and swollen. He knew what that meant. He had seen men die from it, slowly, quietly, rotting while still alive. There was no one to help him. So he helped himself. Near a riverbank, he found the bleached bones of a buffalo long dead. He broke one free and sharpened it against stone. Using water from the river and what little strength remained in his hands, Hugh Glass reopened his own wounds. He scraped away dead flesh. He bit down on leather torn from his belt and did not scream. Using strips of sinew pulled from old carcasses, he stitched his back as best he could, working by touch more than sight. Each pull sent fire through his body. Sweat poured down his face. His vision narrowed until the world was nothing but pain and purpose. When he finished, he lay still for a long time, staring at the sky, waiting to see if his heart would continue beating. It did. The days that followed blurred into one long test. Weather turned against him. Rain soaked his wounds. Cold nights stiffened his joints until movement felt impossible. More than once, Glass considered letting himself lie still just a little longer, just enough to rest. Each time, the same thought dragged him forward. They did not get to decide. He crossed rivers by clinging to fallen logs, his body half submerged, breath held as the current pulled at him. He crawled through tall grass that sliced at his skin and hid dangers he could not see. Once, a rattlesnake struck close enough that he felt the rush of air as it missed his face. He did not flinch. Fear took energy he could not spare. At night, he listened. The frontier spoke in sounds most men ignored. Wind through grass, the distant crack of trees shifting in the cold. The low, questioning calls of predators. Glass learned which noises mattered and which did not. Wolves circled him more than once. Each time, they watched and waited, confused by prey that did not run, did not bleed out, did not behave as expected. Eventually, they left him alone. Weeks passed. His beard grew wild, his hair matted with blood and dirt. His body hardened into something lean and sharp. All unnecessary weight burned away. Pain remained, but it changed. It no longer screamed. It spoke quietly, constantly, like a reminder that he was still there. Glass began to measure distance, not in miles, but in survival. One river crossed, one night endured, one morning alive. He reached the Cheyenne River at last. its waters wide and cold. He collapsed on its bank, chest heaving, hands shaking. For a long time, he lay there, listening to the water rush past. It would have been easy to let it take him, easy to slide in and let the current finish what the bear and the grave had failed to do. Instead, he drank. He washed his face. He cleaned his wounds as best he could. Then he crawled again. Not long after, he was found. French trappers spotted him first, what they thought was a wounded animal dragging itself through the brush. When they realized it was a man, they froze. Few words were spoken. The sight of Hugh Glass needed no explanation. They brought him into their camp carefully, as if he might break apart if handled too roughly. They gave him food, water, rough shelter. They stared at his scars when they thought he wasn't looking. Glass did not speak much. When he did, his voice was hoarse and low. He did not tell his story in full. He did not need to. The evidence was written across his body in thick, angry lines. As his strength slowly returned, so did his focus. The wilderness had not broken him. It had stripped him down to something harder, simpler. Pain had become a tool. Endurance had become habit. But survival was no longer enough. At night, as he lay awake listening to unfamiliar voices and crackling fire, his thoughts drifted back to the two men who had walked away from his grave. He did not imagine their deaths in detail. He imagined the moment their eyes would meet his again. That was enough. Hugh Glass had crossed a distance no broken man should cross. He had endured what should have erased him from the world. And now, standing on the far side of impossible survival, he allowed himself one final dangerous truth. He was not alive by accident. He was alive for a reason. And that reason was still walking free somewhere beyond the firelight. By the time Hugh Glass could stand on his own 2 feet again, the world no longer looked the same. Firelight flickered across unfamiliar faces in the French trading post, but Glass did not see men when he looked at them. He saw possibilities, threats, distances. Survival had stripped him of unnecessary thought. Everything now was reduced to purpose. His body healed the way the frontier healed, crooked and permanent. Scars ran across his back like crude stitching done by a careless hand. His throat never fully closed. His voice, when he spoke, sounded as if it had been dragged across stone. Pain remained, but it no longer frightened him. It followed him like a shadow, familiar and obedient. The men at the post whispered when they thought he couldn't hear. They spoke of the bear, of the grave, of the crawl across open country that no sane man would attempt. Some called him cursed, others called him blessed. Glass did not correct them. What they did not understand was this. Hugh Glass had not survived because he wanted to live. He had survived because something unfinished was pulling him forward. When he learned that John Fitzgerald had joined the United States Army, Glass felt something inside him tighten. Fitzgerald was no longer just a man on the frontier. He was now protected by law, by uniform, by consequence. Killing him would mean the noose. It would mean soldiers. It would mean an ending Glass had not yet chosen. Bridger was different. Still young, still out there, still breathing free air. Glass listened. He waited. He gathered strength the way other men gathered weapons. When he finally set out again, it was not as a broken survivor, but as something leaner and colder. He traveled light. He moved with purpose. He followed rivers and trails the way a predator followed scent. The wilderness no longer tested him. It recognized him. Nights were the hardest. In the dark, memories returned uninvited. The sound of dirt hitting his chest, the weight pressing down. The moment he realized he had been abandoned while still alive. Glass did not rage. Rage wasted energy. Instead, he let the memories settle, sharpening his resolve until it felt like a blade beneath his ribs. He was not chasing revenge out of hatred. He was chasing balance. Weeks later, he found Bridger. The young man froze when he saw him, eyes wide, face draining of color. He stared at Glass as if looking at a ghost pulled out of the earth. The scars, the eyes, the way he stood, solid and undeniable. Bridger stammered. Words tumbled out in apologies, explanations, fear. He spoke of Fitzgerald's orders, of being young, of believing the lie that Glass was already dead. Glass listened in silence. He studied Bridger's face carefully, the way a man studies weather before crossing a river. He saw guilt there, real guilt. Not the kind born of fear or punishment, but the kind that eats at a man in quiet moments. Glass felt the familiar pull and the simple solution. Violence would have been easy, quick, final. The frontier would have understood it, but something else rose up instead. If Glass killed Bridger, the story would end there. Another grave. Another man swallowed by the wilderness. Nothing learned. Nothing carried forward. So Glass did the unexpected. He spared him. "You live with it," he said, his voice low and ruined. "That's your sentence." Bridger collapsed to his knees, sobbing. Glass turned away. Mercy, he knew, could cut deeper than any knife. Fitzgerald remained. Glass followed him to Fort Atkinson, every step carrying the weight of what could not be undone. Fitzgerald was a soldier now. Armed, watch, protected by men who would not care about a mountain man. A story of betrayal and dirt-filled lungs. When they finally faced each other, there were no dramatic speeches, no weapons drawn. Fitzgerald recognized him instantly. Fear flickered across his face before being buried beneath anger and disbelief. "You should be dead," Fitzgerald said. "So should you," Glass replied. He could have tried. He could have killed him anyway, but Glass knew what it would cost. The rope, the end of the road. An ending chosen by someone else once again. So Hugh Glass made a different choice. He turned his back, not because he forgave Fitzgerald, not because the debt was settled, but because survival had taught him something deeper than revenge. Killing Fitzgerald would have given him release. Walking away gave him control. Glass left the fort and returned to the wilderness where rules were honest and death came without lies. He trapped again. He traveled again. He lived among danger like a man who had already crossed the line. Death could not push him past. Years later, Hugh Glass would die the way most men on the frontier did, quickly, violently, without ceremony. Not from the bear, not from betrayal, but from an ambush that gave him no second chance. And yet, that is not how he is remembered. He is remembered for the crawl, for the grave, for the refusal. Because in a land that took men without apology, Hugh Glass did the one thing it could not force him to do. He refused to die when the world decided his time was over. Hugh Glass did not return from the wilderness as a hero. There were no crowds waiting for him, no stories written while he still breathed, no sense that the world owed him anything for what he had endured. The frontier did not celebrate survival. It simply allowed it, one day at a time. Glass returned to trapping the way a man returns to a familiar scar carefully, without illusion. His body was forever changed. Scars tightened in the cold, old wounds burned when storms rolled in. His throat never healed cleanly, and his voice carried the sound of damage that could not be undone. But he moved with a quiet certainty now, as if death had already inspected him once and found him unworthy of keeping. Men who met him later noticed something unsettling. Hugh Glass did not hurry. He did not boast. He did not speak of the bear unless asked, and even then, his words were sparse. What marked him was not bravado, but calm, the kind that comes from knowing the worst has already happened. The wilderness treated him differently after that. It still threatened. It still demanded respect. But it no longer surprised him. Glass read the land the way other men read faces. He knew when to press forward and when to wait. He understood that survival was not about conquering nature, but learning how to move through it without challenge or complaint. He hunted. He trapped. He crossed paths with men who had heard whispers of his story, men who studied his scars when they thought he wasn't watching. Some asked how he had done it, how he had crawled out of a grave and crossed hundreds of miles with a broken body and nothing but rage to keep him alive. Glass never gave them the answer they wanted, because the truth was not simple. He had not survived because he was stronger than other men. He had survived because he refused to surrender the decision of when he would die. That choice, quiet, stubborn, relentless, had carried him farther than muscle or weapons ever could. He thought of Fitzgerald sometimes, though not with the heat people expected. There was no satisfaction in knowing the man still lived. No peace in imagining his end. Fitzgerald was a closed chapter, not forgiven, but no longer consuming the pages of Glass's life. Bridger, however, lingered in his thoughts. Glass wondered whether the young man had lived well or poorly with the weight left on his shoulders. Whether mercy had shaped him into something better or haunted him into something worse. Glass understood then that mercy was not softness. It was a burden passed from one man to another. Years passed. The frontier shifted. New faces arrived. Old ones disappeared. The wilderness claimed men who believed themselves ready and spared others without explanation. Hugh Glass continued on, a living contradiction, a man who should have died loudly and instead lived quietly. Then, one day, the wilderness took him. There was no bear this time. No grave. No betrayal whispered behind his back. Just a sudden violence, swift and unceremonious. An ambush. A moment. A breath cut short. Hugh Glass died the way most mountain men did, without witnesses who could fully explain it, without time to prepare, without the world slowing down to mark his passing. And yet, death did not erase him. Because Hugh Glass had already done the impossible once. His story moved faster than his body ever could. It traveled down rivers, across camps, through trading posts and firelit nights. Men repeated it not because it was comforting, but because it was unsettling. It challenged the limits they believed governed human endurance. The story changed with retelling. Details blurred, pain grew sharper, distances stretched. But the heart of it remained untouched. A man was torn apart by a grizzly bear. A man was buried while still alive. A man crawled out of his own grave and crossed the wilderness on shattered bones and unbroken will. And when he reached the men who had abandoned him, he chose not blood but restraint. That choice was what turned survival into legend. Hugh Glass was not immortal. He was not fearless. He was not blessed by fate. He was a man who endured longer than death expected him to. A man who refused to vanish simply because the world found it inconvenient to wait. In the American frontier, legends were not born from perfection. They were born from defiance. Glass's life stands as a reminder that survival is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet, grinding, measured in inches and breath, and nights spent alone with pain. Sometimes it is the decision to move when stopping would be easier. Sometimes it is choosing to live, not because life is kind, but because surrender feels wrong. The wilderness tried to claim Hugh Glass. Men tried to bury him. And still, he came back. Not unchanged, not unscarred, but unbroken. If this story stayed with you, if it made you wonder how far a human being can be pushed before something inside finally breaks, then you understand why. Hugh Glass remains one of the greatest survival legends of the American frontier. Subscribe to Legends of the Wild West for more true stories of men who faced death, betrayal, and the unforgiving wilderness and refused to disappear. And leave a comment below. Was Hugh Glass's greatest strength his endurance, or his choice to walk away when revenge was within reach?